Now let's take a look at question 13. The federal statute relating to disbursement of highway funds conditioned on the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit is probably constitutional on the basis of both the spending power and the commerce power. D is the best answer because it recognizes that both the commerce power and the spending power are sources of authority for this statute. In order for a federal law to be constitutional, it must be rationally related to one of Congress's enumerated powers, or it must be a necessary and proper means of effectuating such a power. Here, the disbursement of highway funds is not an enumerated power. So, in order for it to be valid, the law would have to be rationally related to a power that is an enumerated power, or necessary and proper to effectuate such a power. Option D is correct in stating that the statute could be based on Congress's enumerated spending power. The spending power is Article 1, Section 8, and it empowers Congress to tax and spend to provide for the general welfare. Thus, as long as Congress could reasonably believe that the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit will benefit the public as a whole, in other words, if the rational relation test is satisfied, the law will be constitutional as an exercise of the spending power. A 55-mile-an-hour speed limit would result in lowered gas consumption and fewer traffic deaths, among other things. So Congress clearly could find that the speed limit would be beneficial to the public. Consequently, the law would be a valid exercise of the spending power. D also is correct in stating that the commerce power is a source of power for enacting the statute. Conditioning highway improvement funds on the imposition of a speed limit on highways, which frequently are used for interstate travel, could affect interstate commerce. And as such, the speed limit would be a valid exercise of Congress's authority over commerce. Because option D recognizes that both the commerce power and the spending power provide authority for the statute at issue here, it's the best answer. A isn't the best response because A ignores that both the spending power and the commerce power would be a valid basis for the constitutionality of the statute. B is wrong because it limits the basis of the statute's constitutionality to the spending power, when in fact the statute also could be based on the commerce power. C is wrong for exactly the opposite reason as B. It limits the basis of the statute's constitutionality to the commerce power, when, in fact, the statute also could be based on the spending power. Now, let's go to question 14, a short fact pattern. A state statute requires that all buses which operate as common carriers on the highways of the state shall be equipped with seat belts for passengers. Transport Lines, an interstate carrier, challenges the validity of this statute and the right of the state to make this requirement. What is the best basis for a constitutional challenge by Transport Lines? Answer: C. Unreasonable burden on interstate commerce. C is the best answer because it is correct in identifying the central reason the statute will be unconstitutional. It places an undue burden on interstate commerce. As far as interstate commerce goes, state regulation is valid only if the state's interest is substantial. The regulation is non-discriminatory, and the burden on interstate commerce is slight. Here, the state would clearly have a valid interest in the safety of its citizens, and this interest may be substantial. However, the burden on interstate commerce also would be substantial because it would prohibit non-equipped buses from operating on interstate highways. In analyzing this, you may come to the conclusion that the state interest outweighs the burden and that the statute should be valid. It doesn't really matter, though, because all the question is asking you for is the basis of the best constitutional challenge. If the statute is invalid at all, it's as a burden on interstate commerce and not any of the basis mentioned in the other three options. So, the statute still could be constitutional, although it's unlikely, with C still being the best answer. Regardless, because C identifies the most likely constitutional challenge, it's the best response. A isn't correct because there's no likely due process problem with this statute. Under its police powers, the state would have an interest in the welfare of its citizens, and that interest would justify the seatbelt requirement and make the statute valid. Consequently, there's no due process problem. A doesn't appreciate this, and that's why it's wrong. B is wrong because there's no equal protection question here. The problem under these facts is the burden on interstate commerce, and that's why this pick is wrong. It invents an equal protection issue. D is incorrect because it mischaracterizes the facts, and even if it didn't, the difficulty of enforcement would not make an otherwise constitutional enactment unconstitutional. The best answer to question 14 is C.